Did you get the notification that it's recording, Elise?
Yeah, I did.
Perfect. All right, let's go. So this month we're going to be talking about Orchidmania, also known as Orchid delirium, orchid fever, or the kind of place of orchids in Victorian culture. And this is our November 2023 Orchid Chat for Niños. So Orchid Maniacs are everywhere, but mostly they were in Victorian times. Um, Orchid mania was the term that they used in Victorian times to describe this orchid obsession. Um, and so this was a time period when wealthy Victorians would pay thousands of dollars for a single plant. They were a really intense symbol of like luxury, supreme wealth. It's also really great for love. So to give your orchid to give your sweetheart an orchid was a really big gesture of love. And then if she wore that orchid, orchids were really big for ladies to wear. It was a big deal as well. The language of flowers was really prominent in Victorian times. So the height of this disease was the 1830s to the 1920s. So this ended like 100 years ago, which in the grand scheme is not that long. So before the 1830s, orchids were kind of just like sort of a legend. They were something you only read about in books. The first written reportings of orchids that I have found was from a 1600s Dutch explorer who wrote about these, very cool tropical plants.
Okay. Come here.
And then we're
Yeah,
gonna move
so
on to the legend beginning.
the first orchid that was imported was actually packing material in a crate for other plants. Um, and there's a lot of legend, right, around like the first orchid. Um, some people claim that, the guy pulled it out and grew it and it bloomed. And everyone was like so amazed and so blown away by it that they caught, orchid fever, orchid mania. Um, but there are other reports that like this guy specifically imported this plant, like knowing that a lot of people would find its value and its beauty, just because it has a large flower. And like, how can you not love cattleyas?
There, some of the other legends say that this man named Duke Cavendish, who was a wealthy duke, he was an avid collector of a lot of things, leased out some of his land to the Royal Horticulture Society, and they would hold shows there. And at one of these shows, he saw something called the butterfly orchid, and he paid several £100s for it because he just had to have it. Um, he liked it so much he ended up building a massive 1 acre greenhouse to house his huge, very quickly growing orchid collection. And this could be likely because orchids in this orchid mania phase were really famous around wealthy and aristocratic people. So to think that maybe it kind of started with, one person who was an aristocrat could be likely too. There are lots of stories.
Yeah, it was definitely a status symbol. Um, so we move on to how orchids were, collected, found, and originally, you didn't have airplanes, so they were shipped on a sailboat across the sea. And a lot of these plants had a very hard time making that trip across the ocean, um, just because there's salty water everywhere. It's very rough conditions. You've got a lot of sun oftentimes. A lot of these ships too would sink or get in shipwrecks, and you'd lose a lot of plants. Um, but in 1833, I don't have his name. I think his name was like Edward Wardian. Is that his name? I can't remember it off the top of my head. Um, but he came up with this Wardian case, which is essentially a terrarium. And it seems like so obvious to us, I guess, now, that, oh, you can just like put them in a glass box and then pack them in tightly and they can make that journey across the sea much easier because they're in a self-contained kind of vessel. And you don't have to add extra water. You don't have to worry about using your fresh water on these plants. But it was like groundbreaking when it first happened. And the first plant that was shipped, it was shipped to Australia, was a fern, and everyone like had their minds blown that this very sensitive fern was able to make this trip across the ocean. So this really allowed what we're going to talk about next to happen.
Yeah, so the kind of orchid industry broke into the market and exploded. And Frederick Sanders was the king of orchids. He had an orchid expedition empire that he ran with another orchid hunter whose name is Roselle, and he did a crazy booming business. And one of the ways he managed to do this was he hired out explorers. A lot of people, some of the other people would go, collect their plants and sell it themselves. But Frederick Sanders was like, no, I'm going to hire people to do this for me. And he was apparently a very honest, good businessman. People really liked dealing with him. They said he was just really honest and kind. And I think the only people that would disagree were the people that did work for him. So apparently at one point he had 23 different explorers, and sometimes things would go wrong. Pretty often things would go wrong on these orchid expeditions. And he was not a very lenient boss. At one point, this guy was out, and apparently like 8 of the other people he had gone with were killed. And he kind of wrote to Sanders, and he was like, hey, Frederick Sanders, I'd really like to go home. Like, everyone died. And Frederick Sanders just sent him back a very, very brief note that just said, like, something along the lines of, get the plants. And so this guy had to go out and get the plants, and then he was allowed to go back home. And this, like, ruthless kind of boss mentality did pay off, because at one point, Sanders had 60 greenhouses that were just stuffed to the brim. Like, as full as you can ever think, they were packed. He expanded locations several times, and he even ran other locations. So he tried at one point to run operation in New Jersey in the United States, but he found it was just too far and he couldn't control the business properly. So he pulled the plug on that. And he then successfully opened a location that he ran in Belgium, which was much more manageable to travel to, see what was happening. And that location also ended up having dozens of greenhouses that were just filled. And this was really beneficial because he had so many orchids, he was allowed to kind of offer orchids to people of all budgets. So it kind of became something that, I think at one point I heard a story that he sold an orchid to someone for 10 pounds, which was a lot of money back then. So that wasn't like chump change, it wasn't like our $10. But then he later actually bought the same orchid back from that person for like $1,000 a couple of years later. Yeah, so he was an honest businessman, and he did care about the plants, which was really great. And he cared so much, and I guess he was so kind of good at doing them, and he was so charismatic that he became Queen Victoria's royal orchid grower, which is quite a title. So he was running this orchid empire, he's running this business, and he's also the royal orchid grower for Queen Victoria. So this was a guy who was really kind of on top of the world. There were other people who were in a different situation, though. It's still cool.
Yeah, so Thomas Lobb is more of a botanizer collector than Sanders. He collected for a specific greenhouse that he brought his plants back to. And unfortunately, all of his records of collection were destroyed when that business went out of business in 1914. So we don't have a full account of everything he collected or where he collected, but some of the plants that he did bring back and introduce into, even current cultivation was the Phalaenopsis lobii, which was the first Phalaenopsis discovered, and it became a type specimen for the Phalaenopsis genus. So it kind of became the plant that defined what it means to be a Phalaenopsis. And then also Vanda cerulean. Vanda cerulean is a blue Vanda, and it's pretty much the foundation, or purple Vanda, I guess, but it's the foundation for a lot of Vanda hybrids too. So that and Sanderiana make up, like, I don't know, a ton of the hybrids that are out there and that exist for Vandas. And it's a very rare color to see in orchids too. You don't get a ton of orchids that are that blue purpley color. So it's super cool that he found it. He collected mostly in Southeast Asia, and I mean, a lot of these collectors, a lot of these botanizers kind of had tragic backstories, I guess, or very tragic or harsh things that happened to them. And in Thomas Lobb's case, he was on a ship that, or actually multiple different shipwrecks. And later he had an infection in his leg from a shipwreck, that he had to get his leg amputated, and that unfortunately ended his career. But it was kind of like tough going for a lot of these orchid collectors, and a lot of them like struggled, and there were a lot of dangers too that they had to face in all of these places.
Definitely. That was pretty tough for like some of them. I read a different story too about someone who was out collecting, and they had to collect this certain plant that was on their list, and unfortunately it was growing off of like a dead body. So in order to grab it, they had to take it off of this dead body. And that just kind of shows, like, I mean, one, it was really dangerous because why was that person dead? Was it another collector? It very well could have been. A lot of them did not make it back. It was a pretty shady business in some places. Um, and we don't have a lot of recordings except for a lot of oral stories. But we do have this guy, Albert Millikan, and he found most of his fame on being an author about plant collecting. So he made several orchid expeditions to some tropical climates, and he recounts his tales and exploration in these glorious details. Um, and a lot of orchid hunters kind of died on the job. So we only have the accounts of those who survived. And it's not really sure what percentage of any of these things were embellished or, kind of made up. But he talks about in his book, Travels and Adventures of an Orchid Hunter, an account of canoe and camp life in Colombia while collecting orchids in the northern Andes. It's a pretty exciting title. And this book mostly talks about really just the people he met along the way, all of the, crazy adventures he had with them. He doesn't talk a lot about the actual plants that he found, but it was a rough and tumble, good time. A lot of these places hadn't seen a lot of like Westerners, and, they were just it was an intense culture clash. And also these people like that were the orchid hunters, they had an agenda. They were there to take things and bring them back.
Yeah, and make money on that too.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like secrecy too with where people would collect different plants, and like you wouldn't share your information with anybody else because you wanted to keep it, as secret, so you had the rarest plant.
Was a big part of it.
Roselle is another huge orchid collector. He worked with Sanders. And he was Sanders's like main collector. He brought 8 tons of orchids from South America at one point, which is just like a crazy number to think about. And it's thought that he discovered almost 800 species, and he's got about 40 plants named after him. Not all of these are orchids, but he did a lot of orchid collecting. One of the orchids that he discovered is Dracula chimera, which is the plant in the upper corner there. And it's just such a neat plant that it like absolutely blew the minds of the Victorians when it came back to Europe, and like people were just so amazed by it. And I mean, like with good reason. It's a very interesting plant. One of the really interesting things about Roselle is he actually had a hook hand, and it came up a lot in his stories. But he had a plantation in Mexico City, and he invented a machine to extract the fibers from a nettle, or it's also called rammy. But I had never heard of rammy before, so I had to do some like digging on what exactly it was. But he was demonstrating his machine to a group of investors and got his hand stuck in it and lost his hand at the age of 44. And then that was the point where he kind of shifted gears and he started collecting orchids afterwards. Um, and a lot of these stories about him and his hook hand, he would impress like the natives, and a lot of the natives were apparently very just amazed by him. Yeah.
It was a pretty like fortunate thing though. I mean, he really made the best of this hook hand. Apparently it just really worked for him, which is a plus. I feel like not everyone can pull off a hook hand. But he could. And when he linked up with Sanders, he was like an equal business partner with Sanders. Um, but the deal was Roselle was like sick of having to collect all of these plants, which was a lot. And then he had to sell them, which was really inconvenient because he then couldn't go collect more plants because he had to like do all his business stuff. So he was able to be like, hey, Sanders, doing this business, you do all that business stuff. I'm going to go get plants, and that's all I want to do. So he just really got to live his total dream, which is really good for him. Seth said that orchids cost an arm and a leg.
Yeah,
Maybe just your hand if you're Roselle.
I just saw that. It's very true with this.
Right?
We've learned anything.
And you also talk about how he had not just orchids named after him. That
Oh yeah.
big
So this
part.
was another interesting thing that I found, that one of the plants that Roselle did collect and bring back was Zambia roselinii, which is named after him. And it's the oldest plant evolutionarily. So I think last month we talked about taxonomy, and we looked at some of those evolutionary trees. And this is like the first branch of the plant family, which is super interesting. Um, so I had to add that in there.
Yeah, that's like a really good point about how basically Sanders too, he wasn't just selling orchids the whole time. He started off doing a lot of orchids, and then even Roselle, they kind of were like, wow, we're here and there are all these plants. Why don't we just bring back all these plants? So they started selling azaleas and everything else that was interesting, which is a pretty good business tactic.
Yeah, and there were a few other like Victorian plant trends too, that kind of happened with orchids and with some other plants as they like didn't fizzled out. Um, but with orchids, one of the more popular types of orchids to grow were cattleyas and dendrobiums. And these were really valuable to the Victorian orchid growers, because they were hardier than a lot of the other orchids, and you could keep them alive, you could grow them very well in their conditions that they had. And they could handle cold and kind of that variation in temperatures a lot better than some of the other orchids. And then we talked about Phalaenopsis lobii a little bit before, but when this first came back, everybody like lost their minds. It was another one of those plants that like was crazy to them to see. Um, and honestly, like phals are still probably the most commonly cultivated orchid now. So we see that like this trend, and a lot of the orchids that were popular back then are still popular now. And we see a lot of hybrid lines that have kind of refined all of these plants to modern days to make them more aesthetically pleasing. And currently, the orchid industry is worth $292 million, which is insane.
I read something that it was projected to grow to like almost 310 by 2030.
Wow.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense though. I mean, think about all the times you've ever been in like the grocery store with someone who doesn't know about orchids and they see the Phalaenopsis and they're just like, gosh, can you believe that? And you're just
Well,
like, yeah.
orchids still have like this mystique about them too, and maybe it comes from the Victorian times, but like the whole like they're like wealthy and aristocratic symbols kind of is still true today.
Yeah. Think about like all of like, I don't know, the nice offices you've been in and they have an orchid or a fake orchid.
Yeah.
Definitely something that a lot of people think are only for even wealthy people now.
Mm.
But even then, I guess now and then, orchids had to survive everyday life. Um, and the big thing was to, when a lot of these orchids came back, people tried to plant them in the ground. We learned in one of our earlier orchid chats the difference between terrestrial and epiphytic orchids. A lot of these orchids that were coming back were epiphytic orchids. So they were hanging out in trees, they were grabbing their nutrients from the environment. They are not going to grow in the ground ever. So a lot of them met their ground, like their end in, the most loving way. And it was a bummer. Um, and a lot of the other ones, the reason that phals were kind of so desirable is because the way that Victorians lived became really fashionable to have a front room or a series of front rooms for entertaining when guests came over. But on regular days, your family would hang out in the back room. So, you could keep your cattleyas and dendrobiums in your front rooms where it would get kind of cold, but they were hardy and they could handle it. But since everyone really hung out in the back room all the time, that's where they heated. So if it's, the middle of the day on Saturday, your back room is going to get heated and it's going to be hot. And then you're going upstairs to sleep. You're not going to waste your money on heating that room that you're not in. So you kind of stop. And it gets pretty cold. And the Phalaenopsis just could not handle that. It was way too intense. So a lot of them didn't survive much because their care was just unknown. And the kind of way of living of, front and back and heating and then just not, it just didn't work out. The internet doesn't like me today. But this kind of changed. So some of the earliest books started to come out in the 1850s about orchid care. In 1851, some B.S. Williams published the Orchid Grower's Manual. But ultimately, it was kind of the revelations in technology that made orchids a lot easier to care for, and they kind of went out of vogue. It was less rare and exotic, to have some of these plants. But also, we had World War II that happened, and then the Great Depression in America. So I'm sure that there were a lot of shifting priorities for the everyday person and even the wealthy person, especially because we're thinking Orchidmania happened in England specifically. And if they were getting bombed in World War One, was that World War One? Yeah,
Yeah, World War One.
thanks.
Yeah, no, and this is like when you kind of see the decline too, which makes sense given the, history around it.
Yeah, if you had to flee or, it's like kind of feeding yourself or buying orchids, I'd probably feed myself first. And they didn't like quite recover to the extent, but there are lots of other lingering effects in modern society.
Yeah, so especially with orchid collecting, we see that even this Victorian collection wiped out a whole bunch of species. And there's a lot of plants that like we don't know if they existed or not because there might be like one written report of them. And we don't have any other information to go off of. And we can't verify it because that habitat's gone now. It also caused a lot of plants to become endangered or extinct because of this collection, and destruction of habitat with that. And this caused a lot of like the CITES importation permits to be placed. So a lot of these legal protections came about because of a lot of these disastrous effects that we've had on orchids. And, you know, in modern day, there are still people who will try to illegally import orchids and sell them. I know there's the orchid thief that's all about the collection of the ghost orchid from, I think it's from Florida, that he originally like collected it and like
At the very tip of
stole it.
Florida.
Yeah. He stole it from a national park. Um, and then claimed that it was a new plant that he discovered. Uh, and that was like in the 90s too. So that was kind of a more modern example. Yeah, and then a lot of the other plants, like this kind of did set up large institutions that grow and collect orchids, as well as ex situ conservation. So Kew Gardens is one of the places where a lot of these collections are kind of held, and they're still held to this day.
Yeah, some people tried to bring them, and if they don't win their trial, Key Gardens just kind of gets to keep them, which is pretty cool. But like the thing too is like, so we talked about how ruthless orchid collecting was for these collectors. A lot of the reason too that they kind of wiped out these areas is they would collect plants and then just, slash and burn the whole place so that they were the only one with the plant, which was cool for them in their pockets, but not very cool for everything else that was alive there. That was a big,
Yeah. Long term, it had some pretty serious effects on everything.
yeah. In another way, some of these species are still around because Sanders had so many too. I think he can kind of be credited for a lot of the circulation of what we have going on now. Some of the originals probably were from him. So it's not great how they got them, but in a way, it's good that we still have them. I know that Q is doing a lot of research too. They're doing propagation of species sometimes to try and reintroduce them to the wild.
A lot of those larger greenhouses are starting to do some of that breeding and cultivation with the idea to, reintroduce or at least create like an alternate supply. So instead of demanding wild populations or collecting from wild populations, you have this seed grown cultivated population that you can introduce into the market.
And we've done research like with labs and orchids for other reasons as well, some of them not so noble. So this is kind of another legend about the most expensive orchid that's ever been sold, that was made by man in a lab that it took 8 years to create in this Chinese lab, and that in 2005 it sold for 290,000 Australian dollars. There's no real solid information about anything about this. So just kind of like in Victorian times, it's impossible to know if there's amazing plants that sold for a lot of money or if it's just legends that help out the seller. So we don't really know about that, but it also kind of raises this question that goes back to Victorian times. Why would anyone pay that much for a plant? Why would anyone pay thousands and thousands of dollars for a plant? I guess the simplest answer is probably because it's beautiful, but maybe they want status. Maybe it's for love. You can learn a little bit more about some of those reasons in any of these further learning resources. These will be posted when this goes on YouTube. It'll be below, but there is a lot of cool stuff to learn about this. These people were really interesting. It was a really interesting time period, and it's great to kind of compare it to today.
Yeah, I think it's kind of humanizing too that like people back then loved orchids and we love orchids now. Like, right, we're still talking about them, and uh, in a lot of cases, we're still talking about the same species, the same types of orchids. Um, so it's kind of neat.
Great. It looks like we have just a couple minutes left if anyone has any questions. But if nobody does, we'll just end it, and thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you all for watching this.
I think we'll just end it there. So have a great night, everyone, and happy orchids.
Night.
Sharing.